All right, so in correlating all this data that I've attempted to persuade you perhaps or illustrate that harem applies to these different things, I want to attempt a definition and a process of harem. I would define harem as a cultic act signifying the inviolable relationship between God, the provider of sacred land, and his covenanted people, so as to restore order, render justice, remove abomination, and reestablish holiness. The idea being to purify the land for the nation Israel, God's people, to inhabit. And so several steps are involved in this. Number one, strategic, polluted habitations within the land are set apart for consecration by eradication and burned with fire. The condemned idolatrous populace, along with its property in most cases, not always as we've seen in Joshua, is consigned to the deity by eradication so as to prevent future exchange with and thereby defilement of God's people. Particularly, the sin involved in that is the misappropriation potentially of these items or the spread of this pollution. Number three, precious articles and other valuables may be dedicated for the construction and adornment of God's sanctuary. So that is to be built and to be adorned with these items. And then often a worship site altar is erected, and this signifies that God and his people have taken residence in the purified, now bequeathed land which God has granted to his people. So this is how I would see harem taking place in the ancient context, particularly with respect to Israel. So now we return to this question: is harem genocide? Now again, I admit that these are complex issues, and some may disagree from different perspectives, but I would argue or suggest that harem is not genocide for a few reasons. Number one, I would say the Canaanites, Amorites, and Amalekites are not targeted due to ethnic or political identity primarily, as the Oxford English Dictionary defines it, but because of sexual perversion, pollution of the land through idolatry, and their own aggressive military efforts to exterminate God's people. They are typically taking the initiative in waging war against God's people. Also, the harem has as its principal purview, that is, its primary orientation or intent, is toward the land itself. It is enacted so as to confirm God's sovereign right to set apart the land as his dwelling place. That is to say, he's imposing his sovereignty over the land. It's the land where, as Deuteronomy says in Deuteronomy 16, he's chosen for his name to dwell. And so this is his land, and of course he had designated it that way. And I don't know if I include this in the notes, but another important point to keep in mind is God says to Abraham in Genesis 15, the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete, if you remember this text, and that God's people would dwell in Egypt for 400 years until that sin reached its completion. If you look at the historical aspect of when that statement is likely made versus when harem is actually imposed, it's likely that it's in excess of 700 years. So if you think of that in historical terms, we didn't even exist as a nation in the United States 700 years ago. So the question I would ask is, how long is God supposed to wait for sexual perversion to finally be judged? So in other words, I think there's even compassion and grace in the sense that they're given 7 centuries to turn from their sexual perversion and idolatry, and they don't do so, and so generation after generation after generation continues with this practice. And so God finally, in his patience, judges them with justice. And in a certain sense, you can make the case that God is acting with justice toward those generations and generations of Canaanites who have been drawn into sexual perversion, to the children that have been killed through their cult worship and all of these sorts of things. The land itself was complicit in seeking to displace the Canaanites because of its pollution due to their idolatry. I also would say that comparing Joshua with Judges indicates that these people groups were never entirely decimated from the land. In other words, it's not to say that I'm not suggesting Joshua does not give us an accurate account of what's taking place. We may make the case that in some cases there's a stylistic summary going on, but it's not that God did slaughter every single Canaanite. The historical reality is likely that this was done in certain instances, so we have to at least admit that genocide was not carried out in the sense of seeking to exterminate every single living Canaanite, Amorite, or Amalekite that was in existence at the time. All right, so in other words, key cities were consigned to this inviolable divine right through eradication to express Yahweh's sovereignty over the land as a whole, his act of bequeathing it to his people who repopulate it according to his directives. Okay, so that's how I would see Harem and its relation to genocide. I would say that it does not give us an example of genocide. And of course, that's an issue that will continue to be debated, I'm sure, in the literature. All right, so let's transition now. We want to talk about Yahweh war and jihad. Okay, Yahweh war and jihad. In popular discussions of jihad, particularly as it relates to religiously motivated terrorism that has been occurring in the West, and we in America are familiar with this. In France, they recently had an egregious example of this as well. Comparisons are frequently made between Old Testament holy war and Islamic jihad. This may be one of the questions you often ask. In such discussions, usually the wars of the Old Testament are cast in an unfavorable light. It's said that this is simply an example of primitive violence in the milieu of the ancient Near East, that this is a product of a violent world order, and that same violent world order is on display in contemporary deployments of jihad. So often the case is made that there's really no distinction or difference between them. In some cases, it's even claimed that Islamic jihad is actually more peaceful than the wars of the Old Testament. And in particular, I have two quotations here that are of interest in this regard. The first is by Karen Armstrong, who did an interview for a group called Share International, which is a weird group. They have an internet website, and I won't get into that, but she makes this case that there is far more violence in the Bible than in the Quran. She says, the idea that Islam imposed itself by the sword is a Western fiction, fabricated during the time of the Crusades, when in fact it was Western Christians who were fighting brutal holy wars against Islam. The Quran forbids aggressive warfare and permits war only in self-defense. Okay, so this is hand in hand with a common slogan or mantra that is made that Islam is a religion of peace, often made by politicians and interest groups. Another quote is from John Esposito. He's the professor of religion and international affairs and of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. He's written several books. He's been a pundit on several news programs as an expert on jihad and the Muslim world. He says this, the Quran does not equate jihad with holy war. This interpretation of jihad developed years later after Muhammad's death when it came to be used by rulers, caliphs, to justify their wars of imperial expansion and rule in the name of Islam. Do you see what he's saying there? That the Quran does not say jihad is holy war. He goes on, jihad as a struggle pertains to the difficulty and complexity of living a good life, struggling against evil in oneself, to be virtuous and moral, making a serious effort to do good works and to help reform society. One of the authors that I have found very helpful to shape my own view of jihad, he addressed this definition by Esposito, and he said, that's pathetic and laughable, to quote his response. So the question becomes, on the basis of such statements, is Islam a religion of peace? Do the Yahweh wars of the Old Testament exceed the violence that's inherent in the Islamic faith, and especially as practiced by its early followers? Now, I'll admit, as I've said, I am not an expert on Islam. I have studied some of these issues. And I am obviously coming from a Christian perspective that sees the Christian scriptures as authoritative, but at the same time I will seek to be fair and objective when I'm dealing with Islam as much as I can. On the question of whether Islam is a religion of peace, Mark Dury contends that this understanding of Islam only appeared as late as 1930 in a book by an Indian Muslim, Ishtiaq Hussain Qureshi. What's interesting is if you read the literature that in the early 30s there seemed to be a movement to gain mainstream acceptance of Islam by recasting it as a religion of peace. And I would say much to the chagrin of many of its practitioners today in the Middle East who would disagree with this narrative that it is a religion of peace and who have a very different understanding of jihad that I'll make the case, I think coincides more closely with what the Quran actually says. A former Muslim turned Christian, Nabil Qureshi, I referenced his book before, he says this: "No one can honestly deny the presence of violence in both the Quran and the life of the Prophet of Islam. For these reasons, no one can claim that Islam is a religion of peace in the sense that the religion has been historically devoid of violence, neither in its origins nor in the history of the global Muslim community." And I think Qureshi is right. David Cook, another author who's written a book called Understanding Jihad, he says that the Prophet Muhammad participated in or commissioned no fewer than 86 military campaigns during the final 9 years of his life, on average no fewer than 9 military campaigns annually. So clearly, at least for the founder of Islam, he had a life that was characterized by conflict, by military conflict. Now, another issue that relates to this is the issue related to what's called the greater jihad versus the lesser jihad. I want to talk for a moment about this. The term jihad in Arabic simply means striving. And it's connected occasionally in the Quran and more frequently in Islamic tradition with an inner striving to overcome the illicit passions of one's soul. This is termed the greater jihad. This reference comes supposedly back to what Muhammad said when he returned from one of his raids. He supposedly made the statement that they have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. And someone asked him, what did he mean by this? Muhammad replied, the greater jihad is the struggle against the soul. The problem is, that's nowhere to be found in the canonical texts. Beyond this, another elephant in the room often unaddressed is there's a lot of historical questioning about the credibility of the main Muslim narrative about the life of Muhammad, particularly in the sense that many of his teachings were not recorded until 150 years after his death. There's a lot of question even about the historical reliability of the narratives about his life and times and all of these things, and a lot of this is owing to later Muslims who wrote biographies of Muhammad. Now, some will say that it pertains simply to an inner struggle. This is the greater jihad. This is why Muslim people may talk about the jihad al-lisan, which is striving with the tongue, that is not saying things that are not of value. Jihad al-dawah, which is striving by propagating the faith, or jihad al-tarbiyah, which is striving through education. Now, David Cook, when he talks about this idea of greater jihad versus lesser jihad, he says essentially this is just a ploy to gain acceptance of jihad in the West. This is what he says. This raises the question of whether the greater jihad has ever indeed been greater than the militant version in the collective consciousness of Muslims, or whether its very title, the greater jihad, is an attempt to arrogate to a purely spiritual activity the prestige usually accorded to fighting. It seems, he continues, to the outside observer, a patently apologetic device designed to promote a doctrine that has little historical depth in Islam, is not well attested in the hadith literature, has few practical examples to illustrate precisely how it was practiced, and was adduced in order to overcome a resistance to the acceptance and legitimacy of jihad. In other words, he concludes by saying the name is nothing more than false advertisement designed to pull the wool over the eyes of the audience. So Cook makes the argument, and I think he is correct when we read the Quran, and the history of Islam that it is disingenuous to say that the greater jihad really ever had traction historically in the Islamic faith before modern times, in which it's relegated to the spiritual realm of inner striving. Now, another issue that's often sidestepped by those who contend that Islam is a religion of peace is this Islamic doctrine of abrogation. This is an interesting doctrine in Islamic teaching, and this holds that later surat, that is, the verses of the Quran revealed to Muhammad, cancel out or modify verses that were revealed earlier. That is to say, as time went on and Muhammad was given more revelation, there were instances where he is revealed something that supersedes and not only supersedes but contradicts an earlier revelation and therefore rules out the earlier revelation. Just as a side, it'd be interesting if this were the case with Christian scripture, right? I have trouble wrapping my mind around this. So what in effect happens is you have to read the Quran chronologically, I would say, to get the best sense of where this religion is going. That is to say, what do we find in the later surat? It's interesting that the most violent surat is often recognized as Surah 9, which is the last surah that's given to Muhammad. And in this is found the verse, "Slay the polytheists wherever you find them," Surah 9:5. I'll be quoting here from the English translation of the Quran that's recognized by Muslims as an authoritative one. It's called the Majestic Quran, and it's put out by the Nawawi Foundation. So I'm not trying to use a version that makes them look bad. I'm using their own version. As Qureshi observes, through the chronology of Muhammad's life in the Quran, there is one clear trend. The proclivity toward violence in the early Muslim community continued to increase from the moment they could fight through Muhammad's death and beyond. There's often a line drawn in Muhammad's life at his flight to Medina in 622, and this is when Islamic history is said to begin. And in fact, if you draw a line through the surat that are revealed before then and after then, you do see an increasing proclivity toward violence in the latter half of the Quran. Mark Dury adds this. He's quoting from another Islamic scholar. He says, "The classical approach to violence in the Quran was neatly summed up in an essay on jihad by Sheikh Abdullah bin Muhammad bin Hamid, former Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia, who said this: at first, fighting was forbidden, then it was permitted, then it was made obligatory." And so there is a clear progression as you reach the latter stages of the Quran. Numerous surat from the Quran, in fact, advocate violence toward non-believers, or they've commonly been called through history infidels. And I want to just give you some examples, okay? I'm not making this up. I'm just quoting what the Quran says. These are some of the surat from the Quran that advocate violence toward non-believers. Surat, and I've presented these in chronological order. Okay, that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm not just cherry picking. I'm looking at surat in a chronological, linear fashion. Surat 35:36, "As for those who disbelieve, for them is the fire of hell. It does not destroy them so that they die, nor is its torment lightened for them. Thus we punish every disbeliever." Now, many would say this is Allah talking, but the point here is this is Allah's thinking toward disbelievers, and we can see why this replicates itself in the thinking of Muslims toward disbelievers. Surat 2, "Fight for the sake of Allah those that fight against you, but do not attack them first. Allah does not love the aggressors. Kill them wherever you find them, those that fight against you. Drive them out of the places from which they drove you, for sedition and persecution are worse than killing." Now, this is why a theologian such as Karen Armstrong says jihad is always defensive. The problem is, in the early parts of the Quran, it is. But it's disingenuous to say it's completely or universally so, because as we'll see, as we progress into later stages of the Quran, the gamut is opened to all sorts of violence toward non-believers. Surat 2:193, "Fight them until sedition and persecution are no more, and religion is all Allahs. In other words, that Allah has supremacy over all other religions. It goes on to say, fighting is obligatory for you, though you dislike it, but it may be that you hate a thing that is good for you, though it is good for you, and love a thing although it is bad for you. Allah knows, but you do not. 47:4, so when you meet those who disbelieve, smite at their necks till you have killed and wounded many of them, then bind a bond firmly. The idea of taking into captivity. Remember when your Lord inspired the angels, I am with you, so make those who believe stand firm. I shall throw fear into the hearts of those who disbelieve, then strike the necks, severing the heads, and strike every finger of them. You're going to see a pattern here for why I would suggest that beheading is a common form of engaging in warfare toward outsiders, toward non-believers. This is the famous surah, the surah that is said to have abrogated as many as 124 previous verses. 9:5, but when the sacred months are over, slay the polytheists wherever you find them. In 9:29-31, this is an interesting excerpt because it mentions Jews and Christians. It says, fight against those from among the people of the book who do not believe in Allah nor the last day, who do not forbid what Allah and His messenger have forbidden, and who do not adopt the religion of truth, until they pay the tribute out of hand, utterly subdued. Okay, this is another common misconception that Islam itself means peace. It does not mean peace, it means submission. If you follow the news, there's a French novelist who wrote a novel recently where he sort of looked into the future and cast a narrative of France under Islamic hegemony and what that would look like. And he became, in short order, a pundit, especially after the terrorist attacks in Paris. He makes the case that that's perhaps the future where France is headed. The Jews say Uzair is the son of Allah. This is an Arabic term related to Ezra. The Christians say Messiah is the son of Allah. Such is what they say with their own mouths, imitating those who disbelieve of old. May Allah defeat them. How perverse they are. They have made their rabbis and their monks and the Messiah, the son of Mary, into lords besides Allah, though they were only ordered to worship one God. There is no God but He. Transcendent is He above what they associate with Him. All right, and two more excerpts. March forth lightly or heavily armed and strive with your wealth and your lives in the way of Allah. That is best for you if you but knew it. And then 9:123, O you who believe, fight the disbelievers who are near to you, and let them find a harshness in you, and know that Allah is with the God-fearing. So it is clear that the Quran takes a strident tone, and I would argue with increasing hostility toward disbelievers. And based upon this overview, it becomes apparent that the nature of the striving or the warfare espoused by the Quran is of a different nature than Yahweh war that we have already examined at length. That is to say, the tone, intent, and other features of jihad, I would suggest, differ markedly from Yahweh war and what it is espousing. So let me talk about that and try to draw up some of these distinctions. And this may prompt some questions as we go along, and we'll have a Q&A at the end here in a few minutes. First, Yahweh war is connected integrally. It's bound to sacred geography. That is to say, a specific geographical area, the land promised to Israel, rather than being an ideology of warfare as an end in and of itself that transcends sacred geography. It's not to say that Islam does not have sacred geography, but the jihad of Islam transcends sacred geography because all the world is to be brought under the rule and into submission to Allah and Islam. Yahweh war, as I've tried to make the case, is bound to sacred geography. It's the land of Israel. They're not imposing harem upon Egypt. It's the land of Israel. Secondly, Yahweh war presupposes a unified political state, that is, Israel. However, in jihad, there is no need for a political state. In fact, it's a loosely confederated coalition of tribes or factions Roy Van Firestone, one of the key authors on this, he notes that the Arab tribes at the outset did not perceive themselves as a unified nation or as sharing power over common territorial regions. Most of the Muslim army's initial military victories were won over nomadic peoples and against politically unstable territories which were easier to conquer. Yahweh war, on the other hand, was constitutive for forging the nation of Israel in the Exodus event. And this is why, for instance, when you read the book of Joshua, you see the phrase, all Israel. It appears approximately 55 times in the book of Joshua. The point there is, Israel united under the divinely ordained leadership is imposing Haram in a limited fashion upon the land rather than being a loosely confederated coalition of tribes that are targeting weak or nomadic peoples to conquer. The fear of a divided Israel is a theme which is ultimately realized in the book of Judges. Third, Yahweh war is supremely a divine warfare waged against false gods rather than a religious warfare against non-believers, which Jihad focuses upon. As I suggested earlier, Yahweh war was waged transcendentally as a conflict against the false gods. In Exodus 12, the Lord says, "On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments, I am the Lord." And although Islamic warfare, at least initially, was waged in principle as a crusade against idolatry, the focus typically was on conversion or destruction of idolaters themselves rather than on displacing false gods. Allah is said to defeat the idolaters. In 9:30, the jihadists are to wage war against the disbelievers who are near them in 9:123. Number 4, Yahweh war in its purest form is Yahweh actively and miraculously fighting on his people's behalf in order to save them. Jihad principally involves Muslims fighting in the way of Allah. In other words, the difference is Yahweh fights for his people to save them, whereas in jihad, often the focus is on Muslims themselves fighting in the way of Allah or for Allah. They are to strive in the path of God, 2:190 says. And again, I read the surah that says they must fight whether they like it or not because Allah knows what is best for them. Surah 2. Next, I would argue that Yahweh war uses proportionate violence to redeem or liberate God's people from bondage or peril. That is to say, and this is where skeptics would differ, but I would say it's an act of justice that's legislated proportionately to the sins that have been committed to redeem and liberate God's people. Jihad, on the other hand, imposes no limit on the violence to be waged in the way of Allah. David Cook notes that violence was waged from the very beginning as a core tenet of Islamic jihad. He says this, because of the miracle of the early Muslim conquest, jihad emerged as one of the core tenets of Islam. And Qureshi says the same thing. It's been typically portrayed in the Quran as a violent physical struggle for spiritual purposes, and that this is latent in the formulations of Islam. Next, Yahweh war, we'll look at the last two here. Yahweh war focuses on saving God's people. Jihad focuses on propagating Islam and expanding territorial control. This is a way in which Islam is seeking to expand the dominance of Islam throughout the world. Lastly, Yahweh war is intended ultimately to save and uphold life. Ultimately, it's done to save people, to bring life about. Jihad, on the other hand, extols death and martyrdom in the way of Allah. Now, it's often realized in the literature of scholarship today that a key purpose of the Torah and of law was to preserve and uphold the sanctity of life as an energizing principle and as a provision for human flourishing. That is to say, if you read carefully and attentively, I think the Torah, it upholds the sanctity of human life. One of the most fascinating passages in this regard, for me at least, is in Deuteronomy 20, where the rules of warfare are legislated. And this interesting provision is made at the end of the chapter, which Eisenhower would have never agreed to. And that is this, that when you besiege a city, you can't chop down the fruit trees. Now, why is that? I would suggest again, it's pointing back to the sanctity of life. That is, that which sustains life is to be preserved. The trees haven't declared war against you, so don't destroy those things that preserve life. And so there's a latent sanctity of life principle from start to finish in the Christian scriptures. In Islam, however, death by martyrdom is extolled. David Cook observes, for instance, the concept of martyrdom developed differently in Islam than it did either in Judaism or Christianity. Martyrdom in Islam has a much more active sense. The prospective martyr is called to seek out situations in which martyrdom might be achieved. Furthermore, death by martyrdom in battle is glorified in the Quran as the most desirable end for the warrior. For instance, in Surah 3, 169, think not those who are slain in the cause of Allah as dead. They are alive with their Lord, well provided for. And as you read through the Quran, various rewards are offered, both in the Quran and in Islamic tradition, the Hadith, to the martyr. And these involve eternal life, the physical pleasures of drinking wine and wearing silk, sensual love with 72 virgins, high rank in the afterlife, and special merit to plead on behalf of one's family at the day of judgment. Now imagine in the Old Testament extolling martyrdom in such a way. We don't find that. But in Jihad, it's lionized or extolled as something that gains merit for the martyr. So based upon these contrasts, it is evident, I think, that Islamic Jihad differs markedly from Yahweh war, that there is a distinction there. Now, our time is almost up, and I'm just going to touch on a few things here and land this plane by trying to tie up a few loose ends here. One other thing to think about, there are present aspects of Yahweh war that are related to rationale and necessity. Okay, and this is where I would tie in just war principles that I'll get to in a moment. That is to say, why was it necessary? I've already argued some of these points, but let me just reaffirm this. It's essential to God's plan to bring Abrahamic blessing to all nations. If much of Yahweh war and the war narratives of the Old Testament is an enactment of Genesis 12:3, that is, curse coming upon those who resist and oppose Israel, then that makes sense as a framework for understanding warfare in the Old Testament. It also underscores God's sovereignty and justice. This is a key point. This is why I started the lecture series today with Deuteronomy 16. It's about justice. And let me just say this. Everybody wants to talk about social justice today, right? Even Starbucks tells you books to read on social justice. The problem is there's no justice without righteousness. You cannot have justice without righteousness, and there's no righteousness without truth. Okay, even Malcolm Muggeridge realized this at the early part of the 20th century. He said that everybody talks about social justice, but truth was an early casualty, as Muggeridge says. So God's sovereignty and justice. Also, it's requisite to the establishment and preservation of national Israel in order to fulfill covenant promises. Israel needed to be preserved. And there's a certain interesting correlation here, and I would say not only did Israel need to be preserved from Messiah, but I think it goes even deeper than that, because when we look at the prophetic eschatological texts of the Old Testament, God is still going to do something with Israel. So it's not, and this is what many evangelicals say, well, Jesus had to come, so therefore Israel had to be protected. And I would say it goes beyond that. God loves Israel, and He promised certain provisions to them covenantally. And so He still will redeem them at the end of the age to fulfill His promises, because that's the kind of God He is. It's also crucial to the institution of sanctioned worship of the true God in the sacred land of His dwelling place. There needed to be faithful, true worship enacted in Israel as an example, at least, to the other nations, as well as for the preservation of God's people. I would also argue that it's consistent with just war principles. Again, I acknowledge that you're imposing somewhat anachronistically later standards upon earlier events, but I think it's consistent with just war principles. And then it's functional as a paradigm for eschatological Yahweh war. So let me just talk about this for a moment. I would say that Yahweh wars are rooted in the character of God, and particularly theologians such as Augustus, Hopkins Strong, and others would talk about the transitive attributes of God. That is to say, how does God relate to creation, and principally through three avenues. So if we think about this as a diamond, and this is a work in progress, but I think maybe this is a helpful way of thinking about it. If we think about Yahweh wars and the character of God, we have on the one hand infinite transcendence. That is, we talk about terms of sovereignty and glory, that God is transcendently infinite, therefore He is sovereign over all life. So whether it's the Genesis flood, whether it's the conquest of Canaan, whether it's the Tower of Siloam that fell in the Gospels and people were killed, what does Jesus say? You will all likewise perish unless you repent. So there's a sense in which God has the sovereign right over all life, and He is to be glorified. But as He relates to creation, He relates, we might say, through three primary channels of holiness, love, and truth. We talk about holiness, we talk about righteousness and justice. Righteousness and justice needed to be preserved within the people groups that were in Canaan, within God's people. And so from God's declaration, this was an enactment of righteousness and justice. Now that doesn't solve all the questions or maybe some level of discomfort, but we have to acknowledge, if we acknowledge the supremacy of the God of Scriptures, then the account He tells us is truthful, and the God that we serve is holy. Secondly, love or compassion and goodness. Now this not only relates to the generations of Canaanites who were ensnared in polluting sin, but also love and compassion toward God's people, and ultimately compassion toward all the nations. In Genesis 12:3, He wants to extend that blessing to all the families of the earth. And then finally, truth. That is faithfulness or veracity. When God says that the Canaanites were sexually perverse and corrupted, they were sexually perverse and corrupted. This is what is often missing in the skeptical charges of genocide, is the Canaanites are presented as innocent, and God is portrayed as the perpetrator of violence. My own theory about this is, as people themselves become more and more like the Canaanites look more and more innocent. And it's God that is the problem in their minds. And I would suggest from a Christian perspective, it's opposite, that God is to be glorified. He is truthful, He is holy, He is loving and gracious. All right, and let me just touch on this. I think we can correlate just war principles. Now, this is an entirely different conversation that we can have, and it's something that interests me deeply, but it only tangentially touches upon this. So let me just touch on this. In the 16th and 17th century, there were three leading thinkers, Francisco de Vitoria, Francisco Suarez, and Hugo Grotius, who delineated what are called today just war principles. And they really pertain to two things: how a nation goes to war and how a nation conducts war. And they came up with 7 principles that dictate what is just war. That is to say, they argue that there has to be just cause. The nation that goes to war must do so to prevent injustice or to rectify injustice. Sovereign authority. The power to declare war resides in the authority of the state as a sovereign entity capable of making and enforcing laws, as well as appointing magistrates to oversee these duties. Now, also be thinking in your mind as we go through this, why Islamic terrorism as it's practiced today is not just war. Because it doesn't tie into just cause, sovereign authority, or just intention, or proportionality, as we'll talk about in a moment. Just intention, that is to say, the motivations for taking up conflict and the good to be achieved by war outweigh potential loss and damages. So in other words, there's a potential for good that surpasses the potential for destruction. Number 4, there needs to be a formal declaration of war. It needs to be formal and public to specify intentions and provide hostile nations opportunity to surrender or parley, that is to negotiate. It's interesting that in Joshua extends his javelin toward Ai, sort of as a declaration of war, and that was often said to be the case in the ancient Near East. If a javelin was thrown in your direction, that meant war had been declared upon you. Proportionality, that is, the retribution rendered in conflict must be consistent with or proportionate to the injustice being redressed. This is, of course, a hot topic even today in dealing with issues related to World War II and other things. Was there proportionality? Number 6, reasonable chance of success. War is undertaken only if the prospects for success are attainable. And then last resort, war is to be engaged in only when all other possible measures of negotiation and redress to obtain justice have been exhausted. Oliver O'Donovan, whose thinking I think is clearest on just war, he wrote a book called Just War Revisited, and his thinking has framed much of my own thinking. He defines just war as the extraordinary extension of ordinary acts of judgment. In other words, what he's saying is the government's capacity to enact ordinary acts of judgment is extended extraordinarily toward enforcing that upon peoples who have done something to upset the balance of justice and law. He goes on to say, acts of judgment are the government's truthful pronouncement of what has been done and an effective foundation for what is to be done. Now the question is raised, what parallels are there between Old Testament Yahweh war and just war? In fact, Derek Kidner in his article raises this question. He said, John Stott asked, what are the correlations? And Kidner responded, few, if any. Now Kidner does see just war principles at work. For instance, when Jephthah has a speech with the Ammonites, he talks about land rights. Amos, he condemns the nations in his oracles against the nations for their excessively cruel war practices. Habakkuk pronounces that the violence of the nations will be punished, and the Mosaic law proscribed, that is, forbade scorched earth policies during conflict. So with all of these in mind, I don't have time to develop this. I'll just touch upon this. But we might answer each of these 7 principles in certain ways. Just cause. In other words, if Yahweh is, as we've presented him, the God of the character that's described in the Old Testament as holy, righteous, compassionate, truthful, when he declares that the Canaanites have committed egregious sins worthy of death, we have to take it that that is in fact the case. So Yahweh decrees and he deputizes the nation Israel to enact, I think, analogously to the Genesis flood, as his sword to judge the Canaanite people. There's a just intention because Yahweh directs this for the purposes of justice and to obtain a just outcome. Yahweh declares war. We see this, for instance, in Deuteronomy 20 and 7. There was a certain protocol for how they were to go about this war. It really wasn't just a haphazardly waged thing, but there was a process and methodology to it. And there was proportionality, that is to say, Yahweh discriminated those who were to be judged vis-a-vis those who were not. We see some discrimination, for instance, when they come to cities outside the territory of Israel, what do? They first offer peace terms. And if those cities agree to it, then peace is to ensue. That is to say, Yahweh is discriminating here between different facets of society. There's a reasonable chance of success, of course, when Yahweh is fighting your battles with you or on your behalf. Of course, that's going to happen. And then last resort, Yahweh, of course, gives victory, but it is the last resort. In other words, that is to say, after 700 years, their sin had reached its completion. And so Yahweh said, now is the time for judgment. And so that's what took place. So with all of that in mind, I had said at the beginning I wouldn't develop exhaustively all the New Testament exegesis, but let me just propose a way forward that may be helpful for thinking through this. The New Testament casts Yahweh war in its true spiritual primacy as a conflict against false gods. Now, I think where many of authors and scholars today struggle with Yahweh war is because they don't relate it to national Israel and its occupation of the land they struggle then to correlate it to the New Testament. That is to say, if you divorce Yahweh war from Israel and from the land, how do you say it's not to happen today? And so this is a typical discussion and point of contention as they work through this. We would understand that the New Testament is casting Yahweh war in its true primary form as spiritual. That is to say, Jesus has triumphed over spiritual and demonic powers that are hostilely arrayed against the Lord, against God, and through his death and resurrection has achieved victory over them. Let's just look at a few texts in Colossians 2:15. Actually, we'll start in verse 13. You who are dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. And we could go on and read other texts in Ephesians 4, where Paul conjures up the imagery of this triumphal procession. We could talk about where, as I would even interpret some of the more difficult passages, as Christ's proclamation of victory or as the defeat of hostile foreign demonic powers. So is the believer to engage in Yahweh war? Well, I think if we understand Yahweh war as I've tried to present it this morning, the answer would be, of course, no. It makes sense now that this is for Israel in the land. Therefore, it's not something that the church engages in. In fact, our warfare is consistently cast in the New Testament as spiritual warfare. And I would say that it has connections to the purer form of the Lord's delivering his people in the sense that we're not told to be aggressive toward hostile demonic powers, right? We take a defensive posture. This comes to the fore in Ephesians 6. In Ephesians 6, for instance, 10 to 18, you're probably familiar with this. Paul says, "Be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil." Notice how often the word stand is used in this passage. "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Stand firm. "Stand, therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. Take up the shield of faith, helmet of salvation, praying at all times." So obviously, Paul here is reiterating we're not to, as the statement has been made sometimes, to find a demon behind every bush. Rather, we're to take a defensive posture in standing and resisting. I would say this presupposes that Christ has already triumphed over these evil forces. Therefore, the believer takes up these defensive armaments so as to stand fast against the onslaught of an enemy that's already defeated. And so we're to realize that our role in the church age is not the role of Yahweh war as it's explained in the Old Testament. Instead, it's a spiritual form of warfare that ties into the victory Christ achieved over the spiritual realm through his death and resurrection. I would also argue that in the eschaton, Yahweh war may be a helpful rubric for interpreting eschatological battles that revolve around regenerate Israel, who is reconstituted and regifted the land. This is where I think even Eugene Merrill, as a dispensationalist, I think he would claim to be, does not tie, I don't think sufficiently, eschatological Yahweh war to the nation Israel. And so in this Four Views book, he argues for what he calls moderate discontinuity. And by that he means that there is some continuity with the end times, but it's a moderate discontinuity in some senses in that we're not displaying it today. Well, the problem is I think his view would be strengthened if he realized that the eschatological Yahweh war is tied into the nation of Israel. And as God redemptively again focuses upon the nation, it suddenly makes sense that this is what's going on in these Yahweh war passages of the Old Testament in Revelation 6 and 19. There's another dissertation I've read recently that talks about vengeance in the apocalypse, and he ties into the fact that when God is in a covenantal relationship with a people, and those people are oppressed to the point of nearly being exterminated or obliterated, that God is covenantally obligated in some sense, or through the provisions of the covenant, he steps in to liberate those people. And I think that this is why even in the eschaton in Revelation 19 and other places, when the Lord steps in, it's to save the nation Israel. And I think if we read carefully through Zechariah, we see a lot of traces of this same thinking in that eschatological redemption of Israel when they cry out to the Lord. Zechariah pictures this as families and clans weeping by themselves. They're recognizing Jesus is the Messiah and they had missed him. And so they lament and they mourn, and I think this is all involved in the people crying out to the Lord, and the Lord ultimately will deliver them. And Zechariah talks in dramatic terms. Zephaniah talks about this in certain terms, that the Lord will redeem his people. In fact, we'll conclude here with a reference back to Zephaniah chapter 1, just so I can throw in a book that you probably haven't turned to in a while. Zephaniah 1. It's interesting that if we think about what's happening here eschatologically in terms of Yahweh war, it suddenly begins to make sense, I think. In Zephaniah 1:14, the great day of the Lord is near and hastening fast. The sound of the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty man cries aloud there. A day of wrath is that day, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet blast and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the lofty battlements. I will bring distress on mankind, so that they shall walk like the blind, because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood shall be poured out like dust, and their flesh like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them on the day of the wrath of the Lord and the fire of his jealousy. All the earth shall be consumed, for a full and sudden end he will make of all the inhabitants of the earth. The Lord's judgment is fearful and righteous. And so we rejoice in the promises because, again, if there is no justice and no righteousness and no truth, then we're in a huge predicament, right? As the people of the earth, we trust in a God who is righteous, holy, just, sovereign. And so understanding all these facets helps us to see Yahweh war really is an extension of God's character and his promises to Israel, national Israel, and the land that was bequeathed to them because it was promised to the patriarchs.